I'm Patrick, 24 male. I'm a graduate student in clinical psychology, living in a small apartment in Portland that always smells faintly of rain and old books. For years, I believed the deepest wound in my life was my father choosing another woman over my mother. I was wrong. That was just the first crack in the foundation before the whole house came down, revealing a rot in the basement I never knew existed. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Some memories feel like they belong to another person's life. My childhood before the fracture is one of them. I remember a sprawling three-story craftsman house in a quiet Portland suburb, the scent of my mother's baking in the kitchen and my father's deep laugh echoing in the hallways. My dad, Richard, was an architect, a man who built impressive structures for a living but failed to maintain the one he lived in. He was a figure of authority, tall and sharp-eyed, more preoccupied with blueprints and business expansions than with his own son. His ambition was a slow-growing weed that eventually choked the life out of his marriage to my mother, Clara. Clara was the complete opposite. She was a librarian, a gentle soul with a quiet strength and a warmth that could make any storm feel distant. Her love was the anchor of my young life. I can still feel her hand stroking my hair as she read to me, her voice a soft melody against the rhythm of the Oregon rain. But the harmony in our home was fragile. Night after night, I'd lie in bed, clutching a stuffed bear, my small body tense as the muffled sounds of their arguments seeped through the walls. It was always about money, about Richard's long hours, about the emotional distance that had become a permanent resident in our house. When I was 10, the inevitable happened. The divorce was finalized, and the life I knew was dismantled piece by piece. The court, in its infinite and often misguided wisdom, decided that a man with a successful firm and a big house was a more suitable guardian than a woman with a part-time library job. My mother packed a single suitcase, her hands trembling as she pulled me into an embrace that felt like a final, desperate attempt to hold our world together. "You are my everything, Patrick," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I watched from the hallway as her car disappeared down the street, feeling a profound sense of abandonment, a cold certainty that I was somehow to blame. From that day on, a part of me shut down. The world felt unstable, and I learned to navigate it with caution, never getting too attached to anything or anyone. My father, now a single parent, barely registered the change in me. I was a logistical requirement, another item on his checklist. He made sure I was fed and clothed, but the boy inside, the one who had lost his mother, was invisible to him. 2 years later, Evelyn entered the picture. She was Richard's new wife, a woman a decade younger than him with polished blonde hair and a smile that was perfectly crafted but utterly devoid of warmth. She was an expert conversationalist, charming and witty, and she managed to make my father laugh, a sound I hadn't heard since my mother left. But when her gaze fell on me, it was like looking through glass. She would ask, "How are you, Patrick?" But the question was a social formality, a placeholder in the silence at the dinner table. Her concern was a performance, and I was an unwilling audience member. My father's personality shifted under her influence. He became deferential, allowing her to make every decision from the major to the mundane. Soon after, my half-siblings Leo and Mia were born. They were 12 and 14 years my junior, respectively, and they became the sons around which Richard and Evelyn's new universe revolved. They were sweet kids, and I tried to be a good big brother, but their presence only amplified my status as an outsider. I was a relic from a past life, a ghost haunting the hallways of a home that was no longer mine. The craftsman house itself began to feel alien. The garden my mother had so lovingly tended was now manicured into submission, and the familiar warmth was replaced by a sterile, showroom-like tidiness. Of all the changes, the one that unsettled me most was the basement. As a child, it was just a dark, musty space I was told to avoid. But from the day Evelyn moved in, it became strictly forbidden territory. A heavy-duty lock appeared on the old wooden door. "It's for safety, Patrick," she'd said, her voice a soft, silken warning. "There are old wires and mold. It's not a place for you to be." My father just nodded in agreement, and I, a boy desperate to avoid conflict, didn't question it. Yet every time I passed that door, an inexplicable sense of dread washed over me, a feeling had something sinister was being kept behind it. The subsequent years were a blur of loneliness. I mastered the art of being agreeable, of nodding when my father spoke of his firm's successes and smiling when Evelyn inquired about school. My only lifeline was the weekend phone calls with my mother. She had moved in with my grandparents and, despite the distance, remained my closest confidant. I poured out all the feelings I kept locked away at home, and she listened, always offering the same gentle encouragement. "You're so much stronger than you think, Patrick," she'd say, and for a little while I'd believe her. I was grateful my father never tried to stop me from contacting her. It was the one small mercy he afforded me. At 18, I couldn't wait to leave. I moved into a dorm in Portland for college and never looked back. But even in my own apartment, the shadow of that house, and specifically its locked basement, lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't have known then that the key to understanding my entire life lay buried in that darkness waiting. Now at 24, my life is a quiet collection of routines. I live in a modest apartment, work my way through a demanding graduate program, and rely on a part-time job at the university library and a small monthly allowance from my mother. My visits with her are a sacred ritual. Driving the few hours to her small town feels like coming home. In the warmth of her kitchen, surrounded by the familiar scent of tea and old books, the carefully constructed walls I build around myself in Portland crumble. I can be vulnerable, I can be myself, a version of Patrick that doesn't exist anywhere else. My relationship with my father and Evelyn, however, is a carefully maintained distance. I visit the Craftsman house only on occasion, usually prompted by a text from Leo or Mia. Richard and I speak in pleasantries, our conversations skating over the surface of our fractured history. Evelyn continues her performance as the doting stepmother, her smiles as bright and hollow as ever. But a few months ago, things took a strange turn. It began subtly with a persistent fatigue that clung to me like a heavy coat. Then came the headaches, sharp, debilitating waves of pain that would strike without warning. Some mornings, I'd wake up so dizzy the room would spin, forcing me to sit on the edge of the bed until the world settled. I'd always been healthy, so these symptoms were alarming. A visit to the doctor led to a series of tests, brain scans, blood work, the full battery, but everything came back normal. It's likely stress-related, the doctor concluded, handing me a prescription for vitamins and a recommendation to get more rest. I followed his advice, but the exhaustion and pain only deepened. It was around this time that Evelyn's behavior shifted. Her phone calls became more frequent, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "Patrick, darling, we miss you," she'd coo. "Why don't you come for dinner this weekend? I'm making your favorite." It was a jarring change of pace. After years of polite indifference, this sudden attentiveness felt suspicious. A part of me wanted to believe it was a genuine olive branch, a late attempt to build a real connection. But my intuition screamed that something was wrong. Against my better judgment, I started visiting more often, drawn in by her invitations and a sense of duty to my half-siblings. The family dinners were staged productions of domestic bliss. The dining room was aglow with warm light, the table laden with impeccably prepared dishes. But with every meal, a peculiar sensation grew stronger. The food, while looking perfect, often carried a faint, unidentifiable aftertaste. It wasn't that it was spoiled, it was a subtle metallic or chemical note that lingered on my tongue. I mentioned it once and Evelyn brushed it off with a radiant smile. "Oh, that's just a new spice blend I'm trying out," she'd said. Richard, absorbed in his phone, didn't even look up. My health deteriorated with each visit. The headaches became more severe and the fatigue was so profound that I sometimes struggled to get through a day of classes. The connection seemed undeniable. I felt worse after every meal I ate in that house. I started keeping a journal, tracking my symptoms, trying to find a logical explanation. Was I developing a food allergy? Was it all in my head, a physical manifestation of my discomfort? The unease extended beyond the dinner table. On the nights I stayed over, I would be jolted awake by strange noises. Faint clanging sounds like metal being dragged across a concrete floor seemed to emanate from the basement. Following the sounds would be a sharp, acrid smell, something like burning herbs mixed with a chemical sting that would drift under my bedroom door. I'd get up to investigate, but the house would be still and dark, the hallway silent. The basement door, as always, remained secure. "Sleekhead." When I casually asked Evelyn about the noises, her eyes narrowed for a split second before her pleasant mask slipped back into place. "It's probably just the old furnace, Patrick," she'd said smoothly. "This house makes all sorts of strange sounds." Her explanations were always plausible, always designed to make me feel like I was overreacting. She was gaslighting me, and she was so good at it that I began to doubt my own perceptions. I was trapped in a cycle of suspicion and self-doubt. My mind told me I was being paranoid, that my long-held resentment toward her was warping my judgment. But my body was telling a different story. The persistent sickness, the strange tastes, the unsettling nighttime occurrences, they were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet assemble. The instinct that something was deeply wrong in that house, specifically with Evelyn, became a constant, low-grade hum in the back of my mind. It was a terrifying premonition, a whisper warning me that I was in danger from the one place that was supposed to be safe. I started making excuses, declining her dinner invitations, desperate to put some distance between myself and the source of my growing dread. A few weeks of avoidance brought a slight improvement in my health. The headaches subsided, and the oppressive fatigue began to lift. I threw myself into my studies, trying to convince myself that the doctor was right, it had just been stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something sinister. One overcast Saturday afternoon, while organizing paperwork in my apartment, I realized I'd left a crucial folder at my father's house. It contained university transcripts and financial aid documents I needed for a fellowship application. Alongside it was an old camera I'd used for a photography elective. I groaned in frustration. The family was away on a week-long vacation to the coast, a trip to which I hadn't been invited. The familiar sting of exclusion was sharp, but I pushed it aside. The house would be empty. I could get in, grab my things, and get out without any interaction. The drive to the suburbs was quiet, the sky a blanket of thick gray clouds. Pulling into the driveway of the Craftsman house, an eerie silence hung in the air. Using the spare key Richard had given me years ago, I let myself in. The house felt cold and hollow, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. I went straight to my old bedroom, a space that felt more like a museum exhibit of my teenage years than a part of my life. The folder and camera were on the desk, right where I'd left them. As I packed them into my bag, a framed photo on the bookshelf caught my eye. It was a recent family portrait, Richard, Evelyn, Leo, and Mia, all beaming at a sunny beach. I wasn't in it. It was a small thing, but it felt like a final, definitive statement of my place, or lack thereof, in this family. A wave of old hurts washed over me, heavy and suffocating. I shook my head, determined not to dwell on it. Just as I turned to leave the room, the lights flickered violently and then went out, plunging the house into a disorienting darkness. A loud click echoed from the hallway. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled out my phone and used its flashlight to navigate to the breaker panel. All the switches were in the correct position. The power outage wasn't due to a simple tripped circuit. Muttering under my breath, I knew I couldn't just leave the house without power. I did a quick search for a 24-hour electrician and after a few calls got a hold of a man named Dave. He had a gruff but reassuring voice and promised to be there in 20 minutes. Dave arrived with a worn toolbox and a powerful flashlight. He was a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor. After checking the breaker panel himself, he shook his head. "Yep, the problem's deeper than this," he said. "Gotta be an issue with the main system. Where's your main electrical junction box?" A knot formed in my stomach. It's in the basement," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Dave strode over to the basement door and whistled when he saw the heavy-duty padlock. "What are you hiding down there, gold bars?" he joked. I forced a weak smile, but Serena's words from years ago echoed in my mind. "It's not a place for you to be." As a kid, I'd obeyed. Now, as an adult who had grown suspicious of everything in this house, that locked door felt like a direct challenge. A cold certainty settled over me. The answers I'd been searching for were on the other side. "We could wait for my dad to get back," I offered weakly, my voice trembling. Dave shrugged. "Suit yourself, kid, but if we don't get this fixed, you're looking at a dark house for days. I just need a quick look at the box. 5 minutes in and out." He was right, I couldn't stall any longer. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I nodded. "Okay, let's do it." From his toolbox, Dave produced a massive pair of bolt cutters. The screech of metal biting into the lock shackle was piercing in the silent house. With a final, sharp snap, the lock broke and fell to the floor. The old wooden door groaned open on rusted hinges, releasing a blast of frigid, musty air. It carried a thick, foul odor, a mix of damp earth decay and that same sharp, chemical scent I'd smelled from my room at night. We descended the rickety wooden stairs, Dave's flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the oppressive darkness. He swept the light across the room, illuminating damp concrete walls, shelves laden with dusty junk, and shadowy corners my eyes refused to linger on. "Box should be over here somewhere," he muttered, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. My own flashlight beam drifted to a corner of the room and landed on a small, rough wooden table draped with a black cloth. My blood ran cold. On the table were several half-melted black candles, their wax hardened into grotesque, tear-like streaks. In the center sat a small glass jar filled with a dark, viscous liquid that shimmered under the light. As I stepped closer, the unmistakable coppery scent of blood hit me. Next to the jar lay a crude doll stitched together from dirty fabric. It was small, no bigger than my hand, but what made my breath catch in my throat were the rusted pins stuck into its chest and head. Scrawled across its fabric face in crude red thread was a single word: Patrick. "What in God's name?" Dave whispered, his flashlight beam frozen on the horrific scene. He took a staggered step back, his face a pale mask of shock. My head was spinning. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Then my light fell on a photograph propped against the wall behind the table. It was a picture of me from college, smiling, oblivious. A circle had been drawn around my image in what looked like dried blood surrounded by strange, spidery symbols. Lying open beside it was a notebook, its pages filled with frantic, looping script, repeating my full name over and over again like a demented chant. The headaches, the dizziness, the metallic taste in the food, Evelyn's sudden affection, the locked door, it all crashed together in my mind, forming a picture so monstrous I could barely comprehend it. This wasn't just resentment or neglect. This was a deliberate, calculated campaign to harm me. My stepmother was engaged in some kind of dark ritual, a malevolent plot aimed directly at my destruction. "Kid, you need to call the police," Dave said, his voice a strained whisper. "Right now, this is beyond anything I've ever seen." He looked genuinely terrified, his eyes wide as he backed away toward the stairs. I wanted to speak to form a coherent thought, but my mind was a vortex of horror and disbelief. The pieces were all there, a nightmarish mosaic coming into focus. The unexplained sickness that worsened after every visit, Evelyn's probing questions that felt less like concern and more like she was monitoring an experiment, the secret late-night trips to this very room. All the anomalies I had dismissed as paranoia were suddenly irrefutable facts. She wasn't just trying to make me feel unwelcome, she was actively trying to destroy me. My hand, trembling uncontrollably, fumbled for my phone. Before dialing 911, an instinct for self-preservation kicked in. I switched on the camera and began taking pictures. The flash illuminated the gruesome scene in stark, horrifying detail, the doll with my name, the jar of blood, the defaced photograph, the notebook filled with curses. Each click of the shutter felt like an act of defiance, a way of capturing the truth before it could be denied or hidden away. "We need to get out of here," Dave urged from the top of the stairs. "This place isn't safe." I nodded numbly, my feet feeling like lead as I followed him up into the relative sanity of the house. As soon as I closed the basement door, I felt the full weight of the discovery crash down on me. I leaned against the wall, my legs shaking so violently I thought I would collapse. Dave stood a few feet away, his face still ashen. He had come here to fix a faulty wire and had instead walked into the middle of a horror story. With my breath coming in ragged gasps, I finally dialed 911. A comm operator answered and I struggled to keep my voice from breaking. "My name is Patrick," I began, the words tumbling out. "I'm at my father's house. I found something in the basement. It looks like some kind of ritual. There's a doll with my name on it and blood. Please, you have to send someone." The operator's professional calm was momentarily broken by a slight pause. She asked me to repeat the address and confirm what I was seeing. I handed the phone to Dave. "This is Dave, the electrician," he said, his voice firm and steady, lending my frantic story an immediate credibility. "I'm here with him. What the kid is saying is true. You need to get officers here. I am." Immediately, "This is seriously wrong." His confirmation seemed to accelerate the response. The operator told us to wait outside and not to touch anything else. We stepped out into the drizzling rain, the cool air a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. I clutched my phone, scrolling through the photos I'd taken, needing the visual proof to keep from thinking I'd lost my mind. Less than 15 minutes later, a patrol car arrived. Two officers, a man and a woman who introduced themselves as Harris and Lopez, stepped out. "You're Patrick?" Officer Harris asked, his expression professional but skeptical. "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's in the basement." I showed them the pictures on my phone. Harris glanced at them, his skepticism not quite fading. "Could be a prank, son, some kind of Halloween joke left up too long." "This is not a prank," I insisted, my voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration. "Please just go down there and look for yourselves." Officer Lopez gave Harris a nod, her eyes more discerning. "All right, show us the way." I led them back inside, my heart pounding with every step. We descended into the basement, the foul smell hitting us like a physical blow. I pointed my phone's flashlight toward the table. Harris and Lopez swept their own powerful beams across the room, and I saw their professional composure shatter. Harris let out a low whistle, his light fixed on the doll. Lopez stepped closer to examine the jar and the photograph on the wall. She turned to Harris, all traces of doubt gone from her face. "This is no prank," she said, her voice grim. "Call it in. We need to secure this area as a crime scene." Harris immediately got on his radio, his voice urgent as he requested backup and a forensics team. Seeing their reactions validated my terror. I wasn't crazy. This was real. This was happening. Soon the house was swarming with activity. Detectives and crime scene investigators arrived, their movements efficient and purposeful. They photographed every angle of the basement, carefully collecting the doll, the jar, the notebook, and other items, placing them in evidence bags. A senior detective, a tall man with tired eyes named Carter, took me aside. We sat in the living room, the darkness punctuated by the investigator's flashlights, and I told him everything. I talked about my declining health, the odd taste in the food, Evelyn's strange behavior, the noises at night, and the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. "Do you believe your father was involved?" Carter asked, his gaze steady and unreadable. I hesitated, the question hitting a raw nerve. I don't know, I admitted, the words tasting like ash. But he let her lock that door, he never questioned her. I can't believe he's completely innocent. Carter just nodded, making a note. He assured me they would conduct a thorough investigation and asked for my full cooperation. Before they left, the team sealed the basement with yellow police tape. As the last police car pulled away, I stood alone in the driveway, the rain soaking through my jacket. A strange sense of relief mixed with profound dread washed over me. The secret was out, but its revelation had torn open a wound, exposing a darkness in my family I never could have imagined. I was at the center of it, and I knew my life would never be the same. That night, the thought of returning to my empty apartment was unbearable. The silence would have been deafening, filled with the horrific images from the basement. Instead, I drove. For hours, I drove through the rainy streets of Portland aimlessly with no destination in mind, my mind replaying the day's events on a loop. Finally, just before dawn, I found myself on the familiar highway leading out of the city, heading toward the only sanctuary I had left. I arrived at my mother's house looking like a ghost. She opened the door and her warm smile faded into a look of deep concern. I didn't have to say a word. She just pulled me into her arms, and for the first time since I'd broken open that basement door, I let myself break down. In the safety of her kitchen, with a warm mug of tea in my trembling hands, I told her everything. I started with the strange sickness and my growing suspicions, and ended with the gruesome discovery in the basement. Initially, her expression was one of worried disbelief, perhaps thinking my stress and resentment had manifested into some kind of delusion. "Patrick, are you absolutely sure?" she asked gently. Without a word, I unlocked my phone and showed her the photos. As she swiped through the images, the doll, the blood, my own face surrounded by cryptic symbols, her face paled. My grandfather, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room, his face a mask of grim fury. He took the phone from my mother's hand, his knuckles white as he stared at the screen. "I never trusted that woman," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. My mother pulled me into another hug, this one fierce and protective. "My poor boy," she wept, holding me tightly as if to shield me from the world. In their shock and horror, I found a strange comfort. Their reactions affirmed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a family drama, it was something far more sinister. The next few days were spent in a fog at my mother's house. I slept fitfully, haunted by nightmares. During the day, I jumped every time my phone rang, waiting for news from Detective Carter. He had promised a full investigation, and I clung to that promise like a lifeline. The waiting was agony, a prolonged state of suspension over a chasm of uncertainty. What had they found? What would happen next? Finally, the call came. "Patrick, it's Detective Carter," he said, his tone all business. "We've been processing the evidence from the basement. The liquid in the jar was confirmed to be animal blood. The symbols are tied to some obscure occult practices specifically designed to inflict harm or illness. More importantly, we got a warrant to search the rest of the house. In your father and stepmother's bedroom, we found something significant." I held my breath. What was it? "We found financial documents," Carter explained. "Specifically, legal papers pertaining to a trust fund. It was established by your maternal grandparents before they passed away. It seems you are the sole beneficiary, set to inherit the full amount, approximately $2 million, on your 25th birthday." The air left my lungs. $2 million. The number was so abstract, so impossibly large it didn't feel real. I never knew about any trust fund," I stammered. "According to the documents, your father was the trustee until you came of age," Carter continued. "He's known about it for years. We believe this is the motive we were looking for. If something were to happen to you before you inherited, the assets would revert to your next of kin, your father." It all clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't about resentment or making me feel unwelcome. It was about money. My life was an obstacle standing between them and $2 million. The knowledge was a physical blow, winding me more than any of the occult discoveries. My own father, the man who was supposed to protect me, had been complicit in a plot that could have killed me, all for greed. The cold, empty feeling of being unloved that had defined my childhood was suddenly replaced by something much worse. The realization that I was seen as nothing more than a financial problem to be eliminated. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Your father and his family are due back from their trip tomorrow," Carter said. "We've been monitoring them. We have enough to make an arrest, but we want to do it right. We're going to confront them at the house." I need you to be there, Patrick. Your testimony will be crucial. The thought of facing them, of looking into my father's eyes knowing what he had done, was terrifying. But I knew I had to see it through. This was no longer just about me, it was about getting justice. A new resolve hardened within me. The fear was still there, but it was now overlaid with a cold, clear determination. They had a plan to destroy me. Now I had a plan of my own, to stand up, speak the truth, and watch their world of lies and greed come crashing down. I'll be there, I told Carter, my voice steady for the first time in days. The drive back to the Craftsman house felt surreal. The familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood now seemed like a stage set for a tragedy. As I pulled up, I saw my father's car already in the driveway, luggage strewn about as if they had just arrived. Several unmarked police cars were parked discreetly down the street. The plan was in motion. I took a deep breath and walked toward the front door, which was slightly ajar. Richard's angry voice boomed from inside. What is the meaning of this? Police tape on my own property? This is an outrage. I stepped over the threshold, and the tense atmosphere in the living room immediately thickened. Richard stood there, his face red with fury. Evelyn was beside him, her expression a carefully constructed mask of concerned confusion, though a flicker of panic crossed her eyes when she saw me. Leo and Mia were huddled by the staircase, their young faces etched with fear and bewilderment. Patrick, my father snapped, his anger shifting to me. What is going on? What did you do? Before I could answer, Evelyn placed a calming hand on his arm, her voice smooth as silk. Richard, darling, let's not jump to conclusions. I'm sure this is all a terrible misunderstanding. She turned to me, her eyes cold despite her gentle tone. Patrick, what happened here? Just then, Detective Carter entered, followed by Officers Harris and Lopez. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, Carter said, his voice calm but authoritative, we need to ask you some questions. Regarding an investigation. Evelyn offered a tight, polite smile. Of course, Detective, but we've just returned from a family vacation. We have no idea what this could possibly be about. Carter's gaze was unwavering. He gestured toward me. Patrick, why don't you tell them what you found? All eyes in the room turned to me. I felt a tremor of fear, but I met Evelyn's gaze, then my father's. I started to speak, my voice shaky at first, then growing stronger with every word. I recounted the power outage, the call to the electrician, and the forced entry into the basement. With cold precision, I described the altar, the black candles, the jar of blood, and the crude doll with my name stitched across its face. As I spoke, the color drained from Evelyn's face. Richard's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. A doll? Patrick, what are you talking about? Are you making this up for attention? He demanded. I didn't flinch. I pulled out my phone and held it up, displaying the damning photos for them to see. This is what I'm talking about, I said. This is what was in your basement. Evelyn let out a nervous, dismissive laugh. Oh, that, she said, waving a hand as if it were nothing. Detective, those are simply spiritual items, things I use to pray for our family's well-being and protection. Patrick has completely misunderstood. The audacity of her lie was breathtaking. Fury, hot and cleansing, burned away the last of my fear. I took a step toward her. Protection? I shot back, my voice trembling with rage. You call this protection? The headaches, the constant sickness, the strange taste in the food, that was you, wasn't it? You were slowly poisoning me, hoping I would just waste away. Patrick, that is enough, my father roared, stepping between us. You will not speak to your stepmother that way. I turned my attention to him, the man I had once desperately sought approval from. For the first time, I felt nothing but contempt. And you, I said, my voice low and cutting, did you know about this, or were you just happy to look the other way while she did her dirty work? He flinched as if I'd struck him, his eyes flickering with guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Caldwell, Carter interjected, his voice sharp. We have substantial evidence of a ritualistic setup specifically targeting Patrick. This goes far beyond prayers for well-being. And we also know why. As if on cue, another car pulled into the driveway. A well-dressed older man got out and walked into the house. It was Mr. Collins, my family's longtime lawyer. He carried a briefcase and looked grim. Richard, Evelyn, he said somberly. The police contacted me, they know about the trust. My father looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Evelyn's facade finally crumbled, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred directed at me. Carter laid it all out, the $2 million inheritance, my upcoming 25th birthday, the fact that Richard would inherit it all if I were to die. The motive was clear, brutal, and undeniable. Evelyn began to sputter, her voice rising in hysteria. It's a lie. I don't know anything about any money. He's turning you against me. But it was too late. Richard Caldwell, Evelyn Caldwell, Carter announced, his voice ringing with finality, you are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder. Officers Harris and Lopez moved forward, producing handcuffs. Evelyn shrieked, struggling as they secured her wrists. You can't do this, I'm innocent. My father, in stark contrast, seemed to deflate. All the anger and bluster vanished, leaving behind a broken, defeated man who offered no resistance. From the top of the stairs, a small sob broke the tense silence. Leo and Mia stood there, tears streaming down their faces as they watched their parents being led away. Mia ran to me, burying her face in my side. Patrick, what's happening? She cried. I wrapped an arm around her, my heart aching for the innocent children caught in the crossfire of their parents' greed. I watched as the police cars, with Richard and Evelyn in the back, pulled away, their flashing lights painting the gray afternoon in strokes of red and blue. As the car turned the corner, Evelyn looked back and her eyes met mine through the rear window. They were filled with a terrifying, venomous rage. My father never looked back at all. The arrest of Richard and Evelyn Caldwell became a local media sensation. Suburban horror, architect and wife accused in occult murder plot, one headline blared. The story of the respectable family with a dark, twisted secret was too sensational to ignore. The trial, which began months later, was a public spectacle. I was called to testify, and standing in that courtroom, recounting the events under the cold, scrutinizing gaze of a jury, was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Evelyn's defense was that she was practicing a harmless form of folk magic for protection and that I had misinterpreted everything due to my long-standing resentment of her. The prosecution, however, systematically dismantled her lies. They presented the evidence from the basement, expert testimony on the nature of the rituals, and the damning financial documents that laid bare their motive. My father's defense was even weaker. He claimed ignorance, painting himself as a man manipulated by his wife. But the prosecution proved he had actively concealed the trust fund from me and had been aware of Evelyn's activities. In the end, the jury saw through their deception. Evelyn was found guilty and, due to her role as the mastermind, was sentenced to 30 years in prison. My father was found guilty of conspiracy and complicity, receiving a sentence of 25 years. The gavel fell and a chapter of my life closed with a deafening finality. But there was no sense of victory, only a profound and hollow sadness for the family I had lost and the one that never truly was. My 25th birthday arrived quietly a few months after the trial. There was no party, just a simple dinner at my mother's house. It was a significant day not just for the milestone, but because it was the day I legally inherited the trust fund my maternal grandparents had left for me. The following morning, I met with Mr. Collins. He finalized the paperwork, transferring the $2 million into my name. But he also handed me a sealed, yellowed envelope. Your grandparents left this for you, he explained. They instructed me to give it to you on your 25th birthday. I took the envelope with a trembling hand. Later that day, I sat in a quiet park and opened it. It was a letter written in my grandmother's elegant script. My dearest Patrick, it began. If you are reading this, it means we are no longer with you, but know that our love for you is endless. This money is our final gift, a tool to help you build the life you deserve. But more important than any inheritance is the strength and kindness in your heart. Never let the darkness of the world extinguish your light. Live honestly, love deeply, and always be true to yourself. You were and always will be our greatest joy. Tears streamed down my face as I read their words. This trust wasn't blood money that had nearly cost me my life. It was a legacy of love, a final act of protection from the two people who had loved me unconditionally. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from the Oregon State Penitentiary. It was from my father. He pleaded for a visit, saying he needed to explain that he was still my father. Against my better judgment, I went. I needed to close this door for myself. We sat separated by a thick glass partition, speaking through a phone receiver. He looked like a stranger, gaunt, gray, and broken. He offered a string of pathetic excuses, blaming Evelyn, his ambition, his own weakness. I never wanted to hurt you, Patrick, he whispered, his eyes pleading for an absolution I could not give. I listened in silence. When he was done, I looked him straight in the eye. You made your choice, Richard, I said, using his first name for the first time. You chose money over your son. You stopped being my father a long time ago. I placed the receiver back on its cradle, stood up, and walked away without looking back. That was the last time I ever saw him. The years that followed were about rebuilding. I used a portion of the trust to buy a small, light-filled house with a large garden for my mother and me. I poured the rest of my energy and resources into my education, earning my doctorate in clinical psychology. The core of my work became focused on helping young people who had survived familial trauma. I also established a charitable foundation in my grandparents' name, the Henry and Eleanor Grant, which provides scholarships and support for children in the foster care system. The money that was meant to be the reason for my death became a source of life and hope for others. It felt like the only fitting tribute to their memory. I never forgot what happened in that craftsman house, but I refused to let it define me. The scars remain a reminder of the darkness I survived, but they are a part of a larger story now, a story of resilience, of choosing light over shadow, and of building a new family not from blood but from unconditional love. My life is quiet now, filled with the simple joy of my work, the warmth of my home, and the enduring love of my mother. And in that quiet, I have finally found my peace.